The statesman must think in terms of the national interest, conceived as power among other powers. The popular mind, unaware of the fine distinctions of the statesman's thinking, reasons more often than not in the simple, moralistic and legalistic terms of absolute good and absolute evil. This is classical realism. Now, from that quote and many like it, you could be forgiven for thinking that classical realism is all about power. And that is a very common mistake. But stay with me and we'll chart an understanding of the international system that is full of nuance, justice and potential. In this introduction, I'm going to lay out a couple of key points of context so that you can understand how this school of thought came to be. And as we go through the video together, we'll tackle one building block at a time so that you can think like a classical realist. So whether you're studying international relations at university or not, this video will give you the lowdown and ideas that span the likes of Thucydides, Niccolò Machiavelli and Hans Morgenthau. In the minds of some, this is what it is to think like the great statesmen of old. But straight away we're into our first contextual point. The first and last of those figures were born almost 2,500 years apart. So in what sense can they be said to be part of the same intellectual camp? Well, classical realism as a systematic school of academic thought came into being in the mid-20th century, largely as a response to the Second World War, and those scholars looked deep into history to try and discover timeless realities of global politics. So in this video I will be primarily drawing on the work of Hans Morgenthau, the most prominent academic classical realist from the 20th century, and the man whom, according to Robert Sweat, took genuine realism with him when he died. I will also refer to more historical inspirations which have influenced the school as is appropriate. Now, classical realism was largely formulated as a response to another school of thought broadly referred to as liberalism. Liberals, in terms of IR theory, emphasise mutual cooperation between states, overcoming power politics and the role of international institutions. Classical realists, however, feared that these ideas ignored simple and long-held realities of the world and would simply lead to more conflict. So let's get started thinking like a classical realist. Part 1. Human nature. Something which sets classical realism quite dramatically apart from how modern realists tend to think about international relations is that much of its conclusions are grounded in fundamental assumptions about human nature. As Donnelly notes, human nature is the starting point for realism, and the core of human nature for realists lies in the egoistic passions which incline men and women to evil. In a word, classical realists are pessimistic about human nature, and there was no one quite as pessimistic as longtime enemy of the show, old Tommy Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was an English political philosopher born here in Wiltshire in 1588. When civil war broke out between Parliaments and the monarchy in 1642, Hobbes took the royalist side, serving as tutor to Prince Charles, who would later go on to become King Charles II. Whilst in the company of fellow exiled royalists, Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan, or the matter, form and power of the Commonwealth, ecclesiastical and civil. His most important work for our purposes here today. Now, Leviathan is a great multi-headed sea monster from Psalms in Jewish and Christian scripture. And in this political text, he argues for the power of an absolute sovereign, a political Leviathan. He takes the first section of the book to ground this perspective in a cynical view of human nature, describing how without such constraints, mankind would be in constant conflict. Human beings, he argues, are prone to violence in the face of uncertainty and logically justified in taking preemptive violent action against others. They are what we would describe as oriented towards self-help, or to use a more philosophical term, egoist. Whilst human beings naturally prefer peace rather than war, peace is only possible through the application of authority and power. Without this assurance, the only option which remains is bellum omnium contra omnes, war for all against all. Whilst Hobbes' pessimism was fundamentally grounded in fear, classical realists do differ in the aspects of human nature they emphasise when justifying this foundation. John Herzt, for example, focused on the desire for self-preservation, or E.H. Carr noted how human nature inclines dominant groups to rationalise to themselves the use of force in pursuit of their aims. Hans Morgenthau particularly champions an essentialist understanding of human nature, which means that human nature is fixed and definable. Writing in Politics Among Nations, human nature, in which the objective laws of politics have their roots, has not changed since the classical philosophies of China, India and Greece endeavoured to discover these laws. But no matter how we get there, classical realist ideas are grounded in the assumption that human nature is prone towards suspicion and violence in pursuit of selfish aims. It should be noted that many historical figures which are often associated with classical realism were not unfamiliar with pandemics, including Hobbes himself, so perhaps we can forgive their cynicism to some extent.
Magnetic vaccine crystals? So I have a key and a bobby pin here. Explain to me why the key sticks to me.
Classical realists are also what we call reductionists when it comes to institutions, and what this essentially means is that institutions are the sum of their parts and nothing more. No new impulses, ways of being, or patterns of behaviour are created when human beings come together to do something. States are therefore just as egoist, just as uncompromising, and just as fearful as the people who comprise them. So what happens when you put states in a situation without a central authority? Part 2. Anarchy. Anarchy is one of the most central concepts in the study of international relations. Rather than its usual connotations of Molotov cocktails, punk rock, and edgy political philosophers, anarchy in international relations simply means the absence of a central authority to enforce rules. And what do we already know from the previous section happens in the absence of a central authority to enforce rules? If human drives are state drives, and humans in the absence of coercive control are violent, selfish, and suspicious, states will be the same. This is because people, and more so leaders, have to make decisions on the basis of incomplete information, deal with unpredictability of their actions, and cope with irreconcilable value conflicts within and among societies. Above all, classical realists recognise that leaders must sometimes resort to unethical means such as violence to achieve laudable ends, and without prior knowledge that these means will accomplish the ends they seek. But we need a way to distill these ideas into a simplified scenario. We need the security dilemma. Imagine you bought yourself a wonderful cabin far away from civilization. The worries of city life are a distant memory as you sit by a log fire and spend your evenings watching your favourite YouTube channel. You always remember to like and subscribe, and you even follow them on TikTok and subscribe to their Patreon. And one day you're out for a walk with your trusty dog and a knife at your hip for protection when you notice that someone else has built a cabin on the adjacent hill. They're even sitting on their porch, so you exchange a glance and go on your way. And the next time you go on a walk, you see them again, and did they have a rifle last time? So when you get home, you dust off yours, clean out the barrel, and keep it with you, just to be safe. And the next time, they also have a dog, so you think to maybe go some drills with yours, just to be safe. And what used to be a fence around the cabin is now more of a wall. It's actually getting hard to even see what they're up to. So you go home and you make a Molotov cocktail. And suddenly, there's a lot more insecurity in the system than when we started. The international system is essentially this scenario writ large. Both actors are simply reasonably reacting to the unknown intentions of the person on the adjacent hill. This is a security dilemma. It is impossible to increase your own security without threatening the security of others. Defensive actions, like a new rifle or building a bigger wall, will be inevitably interpreted as potentially offensive, and tensions will rise. This is why those in the realist tradition will often refer to international relations as a tragedy. Neither side wanted conflict. In fact, both acted with the intention of preventing conflict by increasing their own security. But in reality, they were only hurtling themselves towards eventual violence. Don't mistake the pessimistic view of human nature for one in which humans go out in search of violence. Human nature, unbound by authority, drives us through suspicion and fear into situations in which violence becomes the only option, even when we didn't want it. This is the consequence of humans, and therefore states, in anarchy. Part 3. If you are new to international relations, then you may be surprised to learn that there's a lot of disagreement over the nature of power. Now, Morgenthau makes a distinction between power and influence. So let's look at power first. Firstly, power is essentially physical coercion to classical realists. It can mainly be understood in terms of military capacity. Economics does come into things to some extent, but only insofar as it can improve your own military abilities or weaken that of others. Second, classical realists understand the drive to power as a relative phenomenon. This means that we need to understand military capability within its context. A gun does not have an objective power value. It depends on who I'm using it against and whether they're wearing a bulletproof vest.
Hey!
States therefore don't seek power for its own sake, but only insofar as it provides security from specific threats, present or potential. Thirdly, power is zero-sum. Zero-sum essentially means that because states are always in competition, one state cannot benefit without another losing out. One state's increase in security is inherently equivalent to another state's loss. The sum of the net change in security is therefore always zero. Mutual benefit and cooperation are therefore essentially non-existent without the presence of a common threat. But then how do alliances form? Well, to understand that, we need to go over the balance of power. The classical realist states are constantly assessing and reassessing their own power in relation to everyone else. So what happens when a state finds itself particularly lacking in its abilities relative to its rivals? Well, to classical realists, there are one of two things it can do. Let's say we have here a state of significant power, so much so that no one state can rise to meet it alone. What naturally happens in response is that a coalition of other states rise together to meet it. Our state, this guy, then there's a choice. It can either join the coalition in what we call balancing, and this is the balance of power which maintains stability in the international system. If one state excessively outstrips the others, then it is within the joint security interests of other states to join together and oppose it. However, the other choice is for our state to do what we call bandwagoning and join with the powerful state if we weigh the risks and decide the coalition will not win, even with that help. And this means that when we do win, we will likely get a reduced portion of the benefits of victory, but at least we'll win. Similarly, this shows how alliances may actually increase the level of insecurity in the system. When the major power in the system is a new alliance, other states will be forced to make the decision whether to balance against it or bandwagon. Either way, the potential for conflict can increase. Influence, however, is psychological, it's social. It's the ability to be aware of how your actions will be perceived by others, because the most overlooked aspect of classical realism is always part 4, community and justice. At the outset of this video, I gave you this quote, and I mentioned that many see classical realism as being all about power, and a basic reading of this quote, and many like it, could give you that impression. It derides the simple moralistic terms of absolute good and absolute evil like one of a million carbon copy edgelords that you can find on the internet. And this simplistic reading persists in no small part because abandoning all other considerations to the machinations of power can be very attractive. And certainly, as we've seen, power is pretty central to the classical realist worldview. But central also to the international system is community and a common sense of justice that you can navigate and use to your advantage through influence. Classical realists believe that, similar to the domestic world, shared norms and understandings of how the world works mute the struggle for power. Things like a common religion or ethics provide a mutual point of reference for what standards we are operating by. Similarly, common understandings of things like sovereignty, diplomacy and territory set the bounds of what is acceptable. They especially provide a common sense of justice and fairness, which allows states to manage the expectations of others. The important distinction between classical realists and some other theories is that these common understandings will not work if they are enforced by an international institution like the UN or the League of Nations. These common virtues must be abided by in an unmitigated anarchy rather than handed down. Now, many classical realists divide states into revisionist states and status quo states. Status quo states are okay with the current formulation of international society, its understandings of key norms and the distribution of power, and revisionist states seek to change the international order and its rules. It's very easy to assume that status quo states are powerful hegemons and revisionist states are rising powers. However, over the last 30 years, some scholars have described the US as a revisionist power, with its desire to create exemptions to key norms like sovereignty, and states like China and Russia as status quo states, as they rely on much more conventionally established understandings of that same concept. Influence is the ability to articulate an appropriate sense of justice which rationalizes the distribution of power. The balance of power is therefore not only maintained by power, but by justifications for power that appeal to popularly held understandings of good and evil. It is the job of the classical realist policy analyst to ensure powerful states restrain themselves. Thucydides writes in his History of the Peloponnesian War how Athens' hunger for power led them to ignore cries for justice as they overtook weaker states, and that eventually led to their downfall. Hence, Morgenthau once wrote, "The power positions do not yield to arguments, however rationally or morally valid, but only to superior power." And like many of his quotes, this one is taken at face value and seen as somewhat of an endorsement for the unmitigated use of power. But that is not an ideal. That is the tragedy of international relations. So that is classical realism, a theory that wrestles with what it is to be human, the nature of power, and a nuanced need for justice. In this video, we've covered the foundation blocks of doing analysis like a classical realist, so let me know what you think of it in the comments down below. You can also find more videos here and on my channel. This overview is explicitly uncritical so that you can understand classical realism on its own terms. If you want me to go deeper into some of the problems and perspectives of this theory, then please let me know. And the more people who interact with this video, the more likely I am to upload more. So please do that. God bless you all, and I'll see you next time.
As an addendum, if you follow me on Patreon, you can watch an old version of this video it's really quite bad.